friends, and welcome to another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture on our second section from the book of Psalms, Psalms chapters 21 through 41. As a reminder, this is the ending of the first book of the Psalms, as they've long been characterized as. And this book, the first book of Psalms, is associated with David, with the Psalms of David. They're not all attributed to David, but a lot of them are. And so we are moving our way through that first book of the Psalms with this week's readings. So again, you'll read Psalm 21 through 41. I want to review what I said in the first Before You Read lecture on Psalms about how to read, some general points for reading the Psalms, because I think that these apply, obviously, to this second section, this second selection of Psalms. So the first is, don't skip the superscription, because it may tell us something about the psalm or its context or its intentions. Pay attention to your responses to each of the individual psalms. Is it something that you resonate with, or is there an element of the psalm that sort of repels you or pushes you away? Pay attention to that. Third, I invited you to use the psalms as a way of interceding for others. So maybe you're not feeling desperate for God's help, but maybe you can imagine somebody who is, or somebody in your own life who is. And so using them as an occasion to develop empathy for those who experience distance from God, or maybe even those who experience confidence and are sure of their conviction in their relationship with God. In any case, you can develop some empathy, and it may even lead you to prayer. As always, pay attention to the character of God. How is God imagined by the Psalms? What phrases or titles or images are used to describe God? We often, I think, in our prayer lives, limit our identifiers for God to God or Father or Holy One or Jesus or Lord. And the Psalms give us a rich portrait of how we might develop, how we might bolster our prayer life through identifying God as a rock or a redeemer or a shield or other such images. So be on the lookout for that as well. And then I think I said in the last Before You Read lecture to pay attention to lament as well, and the amount of lament psalms in this part of Scripture and their ongoing significance and value for people of faith. Turning now specifically to Psalms 21 through 41, a collection of just about 21 Psalms, relatively short. Most of them are pretty short. There's a few longer ones. And as you read, I invite you to pay attention to the variety of the Psalms, and even pay attention to the variety within a Psalm. As I was reading these, I was struck by how some of the Psalms sort of don't fit nicely into the mold that I talked about in our last Before You Read lecture about Psalms of orientation, disorientation, and new orientation. Some of these Psalms sort of break down, and some of them have thanksgiving at the beginning, but then lead into lament. Some of them have an entirely different tone. So pay attention to the variety. And pay attention to when those categories break down and what that might mean and what that might say. I encourage you to think especially about how this part of the Psalms encourages us to think about our enemies. How do we have enemies? That's not very nice. And yet there's something visceral and real about the prayer life of the Psalms that helps us to put our burdens and our anxieties and our hope for justice and even release before God. And so how do these imagine the prayer's relationship with enemies and God's relationship to those enemies as well? Pay attention to the times that the psalmist has to remind God of certain things, even ask God to wake up or open God's ears, another really telling and interesting piece. I think Two final thoughts to pay attention to as you read this part of the psalm. Notice the exhortation or the promise about telling the good deeds of God. We see this in 26:7 and in 40 verses 9 and 10, where it seems as though part of worship is testimony, and that the testimony of individuals leads to prayer, and it leads to praise. And so I wonder how you feel about the vocation of telling of God's good deeds in your life and in the life of your community of faith and in the life of the history of God's dealings with the world. And then I noticed in this part of the Psalms, we have more of what scholars identify as the Penitential Psalms. These are Psalms of confession, of regret, of it's a different kind of disorientation, we might say. And so pay attention to some of these Psalms of penitence, and especially what they are resonating in you, how they're bringing emotions and experiences out of you. Finally, three sort of exhortations or responses to the reading for this week. One, look at God. I already mentioned this as a general thing. I always want to invite you to pay attention to how the Psalms imagine God and what God is like and how God is identified. So do that. I think the second is take Psalms 21 through 41 as an opportunity to examine your own prayer life, to think about your own prayer life. Does it resemble the sort of diversity and depth that the Psalms represent? Is it sort of singular? Is it all praise? Is it all lament? Is it all thanksgiving? How is your prayer life? And how do the Psalms invigorate your prayer life? How might they encourage your prayer life? And then I would love for each of you to select one psalm from 21 through 41 to share with the group when we meet together. Select one that really stood out to you and be ready to share why it stood out to you. And extra credit time. If you're looking for extra credit, I invite you to write your own psalm. Take a 20-minute time to find a psalm that resonates with you, or maybe not, and just write one from scratch, or you could use one of these psalms as a model. But write your own psalm. Take that as an opportunity to connect with God at a deeper level. All right, I am looking forward to our next study of the Psalms, Psalms 21 through 41. Hopefully, again, this Before You Read lecture gives you just a couple of things to look for and a couple of ways to respond. And I look forward to our conversation when we're together. Thanks so much for your time and your attention.